Afternoon, and welcome to today's Wealth Management Real Estate webinar, the Net Zero Playbooks by Property Type. This webinar is sponsored by Enertiv. My name is David Bodemer, Executive Director of Content and User Engagement for WMRE. I'll be your host today. In a moment, I'm going to be turning things over to our presenter, but first I'm going to go through the typical housekeeping of how you can get the most out of this event. To improve your viewing and listening experiences, you can move your webcast windows around by dragging on the title bars or resize them by clicking on their lower right corners. In addition, at the bottom of your screen, you'll find multiple application widgets. Clicking on these icons allows you to open and close widgets on your screen, but will not remove you from the event. A copy of today's slide deck is available for download in the resource list widget. Also note that this webinar has been accepted for 1 CE credit hour towards the AEP designation program, and Investments in Wealth Institute has accepted this webinar for 1 hour of CE credit towards the CIMA, CPWA, CIMC, and RMA certifications. Instructions for getting those credits are available in the resource list widget. We also take questions about today's presentation, and we'll answer as many as possible following the talk. But first, feel free to submit your questions to the queue at any time. All you have to do is type it into the Q&A window on the left-hand side of your screen and hit the submit button. Also, if you're having any technical issues, you can feel free to type in there. We'll try to help you best we can. Also be aware that today's session is being recorded and will be available for on-demand viewing following the event. You can use the same URL that you're using right now to view the on-demand version. With that out of the way, I'm going to briefly introduce today's speaker. We have with us Kamli Wilson, who is Director of Partnerships for Enertiv. You can find out more information about him by clicking on the speaker bio widget at the bottom of your screen. With that, we're going to get started. I'm going to hand the floor over to Kamli.
Thank you, David. Thank you for having me. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Happy opening day for you baseball fans out there, and happy to dive in here. So, as David mentioned, my name is Kamli Wilson, Director of Partnerships at Enertiv. Enertiv is an operational intelligence platform for commercial real estate. Our mission is to decarbonize the built environment. And while we talk about these subjects all the time, it's always difficult to be generic because every property type is different. They have different needs, they have different contexts, and different infrastructures in place. So that's the goal of today's webinar, is to break down those contexts and talk about how to achieve net zero within the context of different property types. So to kick things off, we're going to ask you what kind of property types you primarily deal with. So feel free to put your answers in here. We'll give people about 30 seconds or so, and that'll be interesting. We'll see who we have in the audience, and we can tailor the presentation to who we're talking to. Thanks for the submissions coming in. It's really helpful. All right. We'll give it about 20 more seconds. Cool. All right. Cool. So it looks like we're mostly office. About a quarter of you are multifamily. We have industrial and retail as well. Awesome. They will all be covered in this presentation, but I'll keep that in mind as I'm talking through this. So, why are we talking about net zero? Today is March 30th. In April, the SEC will finalize their climate disclosure rules. This is for all companies that file a 10K. So in terms of real estate, that's many REITs out there. In addition to the traditional financial metrics, the SEC is mandating that companies disclose their climate impact in three areas. So the first one is Climate risk, that's saying due to more extreme weather events or due to sea level rise, our physical assets have these risks, and we're disclosing them over the long term. The second bucket is audited carbon emissions data. So the idea here is that a lot of companies have said, we have consumed X amount of energy this year. That translates to Y amount of carbon. That data and those disclosures now have to be accurate, verifiable, and auditable, which is a big change for the industry. We'll go into how that can be accomplished, but it's going to require some additional thinking there. And then the last bucket here, potentially the most difficult. So that's tracking your transition plans. What this means is if the company has stated a carbon reduction goal, it has to disclose a very specific roadmap of how it's going to achieve that goal. And every year it has to track its progress towards achieving that goal in terms of specific deliverables and initiatives that they've not only thought of, but actually executed. So there have been a lot of companies out there that have put together or put forth carbon reduction goals without the plan behind it. The SEC is saying you can no longer do that. You have to have a disclosed plan. Of course, the SEC only applies to publicly traded companies, and that doesn't apply to everyone, but net zero is still important for everyone. Even if you don't file a 10K, the risks of ignoring carbon reduction goals, of ignoring your ESG plans in general, are the risk of stranded assets. The idea that one or more of your assets are no longer worth investing in because no amount of investment will overcome the lack of efficiency or the regulatory fines or simply the tenant preferences that go with that. And nobody will buy that asset from you. So you have this stranded asset that's kind of underwater. And that's a legitimate risk that private companies, public companies, that everybody faces if they ignore this path towards net zero. So with that in mind, how do we go about achieving this? I want to set some additional context here. Achieving net zero is not so straightforward, right? When it comes, to bring a property to the level of efficiency required, it's difficult to do so because all the properties that in a portfolio are generally working on siloed systems, right? That they have different software to do a bunch of different things. And worse, those silos are not consistent across markets or property types or even the building next door. So, one property might be using a property management system and an energy management system and a tenant billing service, all of which are different in that property, and then are three different things from the next market over. So with these silos, with this lack of standardization, you roll that up to the portfolio and there's just no transparency. There's no visibility into what's happening on site, how things are performing, who's doing what and when and why, and how decisions are getting made. And without this transparency, it's impossible to put together a plan and act upon it. Everything's going to end up being ad hoc. You're more likely to say, hey, sustainability team, you go figure it out. We're going to continue doing what we've always done. That's not the way to run the business. The best path forward that we've seen in our experience is to infuse sustainability into normal operations, into normal asset management, so that you kind of meet people where they are, and you can be much more effective. But there's no silver bullet. I'm not gonna sit here and say we've developed this magic technology that applies to every property type and it will bring you to net zero no matter what. There are a lot of different areas that we need to cover, and I'm gonna cover them in the context of the different property types. Before I do, there is some additional context. I think it matters what type of company we're working with. So whether you're a real estate investor who owns properties but doesn't necessarily operate or owns portfolios and isn't involved in the day-to-day, or you're an owner operator directly, or you're a property management company, these are all factors that matter in how you can apply these lessons. So we'll take another minute, wait for people to put in their answer here. I promise this is the last poll, but it's always helpful to get as much context as possible. We can tailor our discussion to the answers here. I see some coming in. Thank you for that. Cool. All right. We're getting there. We'll do another 15 seconds. We'll go ahead. All right. Perfect. All right. It looks like we have a pretty healthy mix. We have mostly owners and operators and other. I'll be curious to find out what the other bucket is, but a number of real estate investors and just a few property management companies. So very, very helpful. I think coming at this from mostly the ownership perspective is what I'll continue to do. All right. So the first thing I want to hark on is when a lot of portfolios think about net zero, they think about buying carbon offsets, right? You're running your operation. There's nothing you can do to change the fact that you need to use energy to run your buildings. You'll just purchase some offsets and that will make everything okay. There's two reasons why this is not necessarily the case. The first is that, according to Bloomberg, the price of carbon offsets are set to skyrocket. This is basic supply and demand. If everybody is rushing towards a limited supply, the dollars per ton of carbon offset is going to dramatically increase. The other problem there is that it's like paying rent, right? I know everyone here loves collecting rent, but you don't like paying rent, right? Carbon offsets are going to be a yearly expense that are going to continue to increase and that you'll have to become reliant on. The other aspect here is that there was recently a big expose, and carbon offsets are, even if they're certified, are not necessarily guaranteed. That offsets purchased by Disney and Gucci and Nike and all these big companies turned out to be phantom credits, and it was a huge kind of PR nightmare for them, and they had to go back to the drawing board in terms of their net zero plans and now their emissions reporting. So we're going to focus on what we can do outside of just purchasing carbon credits. Of course, you might do all the right things and still need to purchase a few of these at the end of the day, but the idea is you do not want to rely on these as a first measure. All right, so now we're going to go through the playbooks, and we'll go through the playbook and then we'll break it down by the property types. So the first step is benchmarking. A lot of portfolios are already doing this, but as I mentioned before, the details here matter more than ever. This data has to be whole building, it has to be accurate, it has to be verifiable, and it has to be able to be collected relatively quickly to allow for this auditing process. So this is going to be the format for most of this. We're going to break down this step by the different property types. So in this case, we're going to bucket office and retail because the context is that the vast majority of office and retail assets are master metered, which means that there's one utility meter that accounts for all of the energy consumed in the building. The process, the playbook here is pretty straightforward. And again, a lot of companies are already doing this. What happens is a software company like Enertiv or a bunch of others get the utility login credentials for that property, log on to the utility website on their behalf through, the software and robots are doing this, pull down the most recent utility bill and take the PDF and translate the information from that PDF into a digital format. The thing that's important here is that a lot of companies do this process and then don't audit that data. They don't take the second step here to audit that data first. Obviously, when computers are reading PDFs, they'll get the data out correctly most of the time, but not always. And a lot of providers just push that data to the portfolio and expect them to do the reconciliation and the data cleanup. What you want to look for is software that has an auditing process built in, that's software driven and then has a human-backed component. Either way, once that data is into software, it can be automatically synced with Energy Star, and you're done with that benchmarking process. And again, this is just step one to see where you're at, to see where there are areas for improvement. That's for office and retail assets. For multifamily, it can be a lot trickier because while some properties are master metered, and you can do the playbook that we just talked about, that's not always the case. If that's not the case in any particular scenario, if the property is not master metered, the second step is to look to the utility to see if they participate in a program to share whole building data through an API. There's a Energy Star website that you can type in any zip code and it will tell you whether that utility shares aggregate whole building data and whether multifamily properties are included. So first step, hopefully they're master metered. Second step, hopefully they're within a utility region that shares this data. If not, you are stuck with just the house meters, which is not ideal for these reporting purposes, but there's not too much else that can be done. One other strategy would be house meters plus a manual process where a person physically reads each tenant meter for these purposes each month. But that's a lot of work, and no one wants to do that. But important context to know for multifamily properties. The last property type we're going to talk about in terms of benchmarking is industrial assets. So the context here is that the vast majority of these properties are triple net leased, meaning the landlord doesn't get a utility bill, the tenants get the utility bill. Many landlords have tried to get tenants to share that data through green leases or different types of agreements, but that is very difficult. It also usually ends up with kind of a patchwork of data coverage across your portfolio. So we don't want that. We want full coverage the whole building across the entire portfolio. How do we get around this context? The first step is utility bill scraping for house meters. So that same playbook that we talked about for the house meters, you can pull down that utility data that the landlord does own and get that into Energy Star for reporting purposes. In cases, or in the majority of cases where it's tenant controlled meters, deploying redundant metering, meaning a company goes in and installs a meter basically next to the utility meter and flows that data directly to the landlord. Once it's in the landlord's possession, that can be automatically synced with Energy Star, and you're able to benchmark your portfolio. I do want to pause here because a lot of industrial owners, operators, investors have looked into sub-metering maybe even just a few years ago, and they found that it was complex and expensive. But technology improves rapidly, as do the operational efficiency of meter installation companies. So, here at Enertiv, we are bringing these projects online in as little as 60 days without any power shutdowns. So it's worth looking again, especially with the context of needing to benchmark your portfolio. It's worth taking another look. It's not as complex or expensive as you might think. All right, so we've benchmarked our portfolio. Basically, we know how much energy we're consuming by property, and we know how that compares to the rest of the industry. The step two is a little counterintuitive for those who have been involved in carbon reduction plans and other sustainability initiatives, because it focuses on operations and maintenance. And that's something that usually lives outside of the purview of sustainability teams and technology focused folks, but it's a critical aspect to the overall plan. Because so once you've benchmarked your properties on Energy Star, if that property has a score of 70 or above on a 0 to 100 scale, it can become Energy Star certified. And Energy Star surveyed all those properties that are certified and asked them, what's the biggest factor that you attribute to your certification? And 69% of them said operations and maintenance over the retrofits they've installed, over any tenant engagement initiatives, over any other technology that they've installed. It's their operations and maintenance. So there might be some kind of like correlation versus causation here. There is data to show that if filters are replaced on schedule and all these preventative maintenance items are completed on time, it actually does reduce energy. But probably more importantly is a building that's really well run in general is going to turn out to be more efficient. It's really rare where the operations and maintenance are on point, but the building is very inefficient. That's captured really well here by our friend Sarah Neff at Lendlease. A building can only run as efficiently as its engineer knows how to run it. Unless you have an engineer first mindset, none of your energy efficiency efforts are really going to reap the rewards. And that's a critical component that's often overlooked here. So how do we achieve this? In this case, we're going to bucket office and multifamily assets, because whether the teams are in-house or outsourced, the operators are primarily responsible for what happens in the building, for maintaining the building, for running the systems, for deciding when systems are turned on, what set points they're at, et cetera. And unlike benchmarking, where we can talk about this purely from kind of a technology perspective, In this case, there's some human factors that we have to consider. Specifically, we need to take in context of what the daily life for a building operator is like. There's data to show that they spend 18% of their time just looking for information. So that's a day a week where they're going up to the mechanical room, they're going back to the chief engineer's office, they're going through spreadsheets and emails, and it's impossible to expect them to be able to optimize performance under this context. And then when they're not looking for information, they're getting a flood of tenant complaints and tenant calls, and they're dealing with emergency situations kind of ad hoc as they come in. So the first thing you want to do is digitize everything. You want to make their lives easier. And what that means is all of the documentation of the building, the warranties and their service agreements with vendors and their O&M manuals and everything that they might be looking for, like when was that chiller last maintained by the third-party vendor? All of this information, make it digital and make it really accessible. At Enertiv, what we do is we have it in the software, but they can also use our mobile app and scan what we call an asset tag. It's basically a QR code sticker that's on equipment physically. So no matter where they are in the building, they can pull up the information that they need. And that creates a tremendous amount of buy-in. The second step is to increase the focus on preventative maintenance. So the idea here is that a lot of portfolios believe that they're doing maintenance and they have it digitized, but it's really only tenant service requests that are digitized. When it comes to preventative maintenance schedules and inspections, these things are still done on clipboards and pen and paper, which means there's limited accountability, limited access to the data that's going to drive, again, those small energy efficiencies, but also general engagement with the operators. And the last step here, I've spoken with a lot of building operators, and a lot of them are very eager to be part of the solution. They think they're doing the right thing, but they really don't know. Tying, their work to the carbon reduction goals of the portfolio is gonna pay dividends. So this is really critical as a first step for those office and multifamily portfolios. For retail and industrial, where the tenants are primarily responsible for operations, we are going to go ahead and skip to the next section, which is tenant engagement. There's very little equipment that landlords are responsible for. There are very few operators in place at all. So we're going to skip to tenant engagement, which means yoga. No, that's not what it means. But tenants do make up 60 to 70 in cases of retail and industrial, maybe 100% of total building consumption. So any plan that doesn't involve engaging tenants is missing a huge part of the overall consumption and the overall game plan, the overall goal. When it comes to tenant engagement around energy consumption, we are going to bucket office and retail assets together. That's because in most cases, tenants are sub-metered, meaning the landlord receives one big utility bill and it's up to them to divide that bill amongst their tenants. Maybe it's on a prorated basis based off square footage or something like that, but in many cases, the tenants are sub-metered. The other context here is that many commercial tenants have their own ESG goals and reporting requirements. This is something that is really often overlooked and a huge opportunity. Unlike the tremendous amount of money that was spent in the last couple of years on amenities and yoga classes and dog walking and ordering coffee really easily. ESG and sustainability is something that commercial tenants are yearning for, and it's an opportunity for landlords to kind of be that knight in shining armor. So how do we do that? The first step is, if meter readings are being done on clipboards, those should be digitized. Those should be done on a mobile app. That data should flow to software that generates their monthly utility bills. That's a first step. It eliminates errors. It speeds up the process. It's a really obvious and should have been done a long time ago kind of thing. Then, as budgets allow, it's a good idea to upgrade to digital metering. Now, I say as budgets allow because these projects can be pretty expensive, and you don't want to just blanket say, we're going to spend $2 million this year upgrading all of our meters, but for each property, depending on the capital plan, this should be considered on a go-forward basis. In either scenario, what we're trying to do is provide transparency to those tenants about their energy consumption, specifically transparency into how they rank within the building and within peers in the industry. It's been shown that when you expose these types of rankings and you kind of gamify energy consumption, whole building consumption falls by 5 to 15%. So there's, it's not going to save the day, but it's not nothing. It's a significant tool in the tool belt. The other thing you want to do is facilitate their reporting needs, right? Think about it from their perspective. If you're just providing a bunch of PDFs and they're getting a bunch of PDFs from all their different landlords, when their reporting time comes, they have to go back to their emails, download all those manually, transcribe them into spreadsheets. If you can give them a portal to log into, download all their data into CSV, you've just saved them, tens or hundreds of hours of time and looked like a real hero. Tenant engagement when it comes to industrial assets is a really exciting area, actually. So the context here is that the tenants are directly metered by the utility, as we mentioned, but they're commercial tenants, and many have their own ESG reporting requirements. They have their own ESG and cost-cutting goals. So we talked about in the benchmarking section how in these industrial assets, it makes sense to deploy redundant metering to capture the data that landlords need for benchmarking. The cool thing is that you can parlay this into a value add service for the tenants, meaning they are used to receiving once a month utility bills and basing their energy management off of that. You can go to them and say, hey, here's real-time transparency into what you're consuming, and we can help you report to Energy Star for tenants, right? There's a whole different program, Energy Star for tenants, and we'll support that. We can automate that reporting for you. It gets really cool when, at Enertiv, we've been doing meter analysis and sub-metering and equipment level insights and notifications for over a decade now. We have pointed those at tenant sub-meter meters and been able to deliver real-time alerts. So as a landlord, you can say, not only are you getting transparency, but we're going to notify you if your systems are running when no one's there, or if your set points are higher than they need to be. There's all these value add services and analytics that can be provided to tenants as a byproduct of something that you're already doing to get that benchmarking data, which is really, really cool. All right, and then tenant engagement for multifamily assets. This is challenging, right? The tenants are directly metered, and there's a lot of them. They often change, and it's really difficult to engage them. So instead of trying, like the utility is constantly trying to engage their customers who are these residents. From a landlord perspective, it usually makes sense to skip to the next section here, which is capital planning. So we're getting there. Step 4 is capital planning. It's estimated that commercial real estate needs to deploy $18 trillion to fully decarbonize. And of course, this is, a multi-decade requirement, but still, what we want to do here is make sure that our capital planning process for everything that we're deciding on, every long-term budget, every budgeting season takes into account our decarbonization goals. That's the overall theme when it comes to capital planning. To do so, we have to understand a concept called committed carbon. So the idea is for every decision that we make, for every piece of equipment that we buy, or even appliance for multifamily, or whether to get smart thermostats or not, all of these decisions have a certain level of committed carbon, meaning for the next 20 years, we are going to be emitting a certain amount of carbon based off this decision, because that's the lifetime of a pump or a motor or whatever, a boiler. You're, without taking this into account, even if you do all the other right things, you will have kind of locked yourself into high levels of carbon well into the future. So these decisions need to be made today to put yourself in a good position for tomorrow. And the other thing that I want to talk about are energy audits. So a lot of portfolios have had these done. You get a table with a list of investments that you can make with their payback period and how much energy you can save. And at the end, there's usually a column on CO2 reductions. But energy audits and the normal budgeting and capital planning process usually are separated. They're siloed and they work in parallel. The goal is to merge those together. So for every potential investment, you know what the CO2 implications are. The other important concept here is electrification. So the idea here is that it's true that when a building consumes energy, the utilities are often burning fossil fuels to generate that energy. So there's only so much that a landlord can do if the grid is not clean. But the theory here, or the actual here, is that the grid can be cleaned, and it is being based off more renewable sources every month, every year, etc. If you purchase a oil or propane furnace, or an oil boiler, or any of these things, there's no way to get around the emissions. You're directly burning fuel, and that's not giving you a chance to realize the gains from the cleaning of the grid. So I mentioned a moment ago, infusing CO2 emission factors into your capital planning process. A big part of that is this electrification consideration. So The nice thing about capital planning is that it is applicable to pretty much every property type. Even if your tenants are triple net leased, that is your asset. It is your equipment in the building. It is ultimately up to you to make those capital investments. So the playbook here is to bring property condition assessments, your energy audits, your budgeting spreadsheets, all those analyses and evaluations that are being performed, bring all of that into software. So at least we're de-siloing everything. We can track decision making, and we can make a long-term plan in software so that it's viewable to everybody and easily shared with investors or whoever else we need to share it with. Step 2 is to account for that committed carbon. So as each property goes into budgeting season, and the asset managers and engineers and property managers are all wrangling about what decisions to make and what to replace and what to buy, at least those decisions can be made with committed carbon as a factor, right? It's not going to be the only factor, but it needs to be a factor today, or again, you're locking yourself in for the long haul. And then you roll up all that data to the portfolio level, and you can overlay that on kind of the step 1 on the carbon benchmarking. So you can see, based off the decisions that we plan to make for the next 10 years, here's how that's going to affect our overall carbon emission and our overall carbon footprint. So that's the capital planning process. Obviously, there are a lot of details here, but this is an area that, again, is ripe for improvement and a solid area to address. And then, so step 5, this is the last step, real-time monitoring. So the benefits here are well demonstrated. You can achieve 10, 20, 30, 40, even 50% energy savings simply by optimizing schedules and sequences and set points, and optimizing how the buildings run based off real-time monitoring and the data-driven insights that come from that. But the term real-time monitoring has often been misunderstood or used in a lot of different contexts. So I want to first break down what those different contexts are, and then we can dive into the property types. So real-time monitoring has sometimes been used to mean only utility real-time monitoring. So that means for those master metered properties where there's one utility meter for the whole property, capturing that real-time utility data and providing it to engineers and operators. The problem here is that it's simply not granular enough, right? So if somebody's talking about real-time monitoring and they're really only talking about master meter utility data, you're not providing the engineers with the insights that they need. You might be able to say, hey, you're having an unusual energy spike right now, or you're well outside of your forecasted consumption. But that's not going to tell them where or what to do about it, or that's going to cause them to have to launch an investigation and figure out what the problem is, taking them away from their normal responsibilities. On the other end of the spectrum, there's a lot of hype about automated HVAC. Basically, let's plug into the BMS, let's run artificial intelligence, and we'll let the artificial intelligence make all the decisions, and that will be, we'll cut the humans out of the equation, and that'll be optimal. The problem here is that it's very exclusionary. There's only so many properties with a robust BMS that's new enough to integrate with easily. And it's exclusionary to the operators, who we talked about are a critical piece to the overall puzzle. So you're only able to do this on a select number of properties. You're excluding the operators, and there are often critical systems that are not on a BMS. You know, like that maybe the VFDs or the elevators, or there's always systems that are excluded here. So it's not kind of a perfect solution. And then the last one is not really real-time monitoring, but a lot of companies believe that they can get away with doing energy audits every so often. Not only will they get that list of investments that they can make, but they'll get a quick tune-up. You know, the audit will say, hey, you know, we need to make these adjustments because they've gotten off tilt. But there's data to show that after an energy audit, you lose those gains in 1 to 2 years, just because life happens, right? A fire alarm goes off, or a tenant requests overtime HVAC, or whatever it is. There's a million reasons why this kind of once every few year energy audit process doesn't work very well. So let's dive into the different property types when it comes into real-time monitoring. So when it comes to office assets, they often do have a BMS, a building management system, or a building automation system. Though some are old, which means they can't easily be integrated with, and sometimes have limited coverage in terms of the equipment that they cover. So the playbook for real-time monitoring in office assets is to integrate with the BMS where possible. You know, we always want to take the path of least resistance and use whatever data is available. And then deploy equipment monitoring where necessary. So in any cases where the BMS is too old to integrate with, or we want to capture additional systems, or the BMS doesn't have energy data, for example, those same, you know, we talked about redundant metering for industrial assets. It's the idea of sub-metering can be applied to tenants. It can also be applied to equipment. So basically, sub-metering equipment where the BMS does not have coverage there. And then you get the benefits of, you know, predictive fault detection, optimizations, and you get enhanced data. You can see, you know, chiller efficiency and the runtime hours for individual pieces of equipment. You can see carbon emissions down to the equipment level and use those in your capital plans as well as in your operations and maintenance strategies. Real-time monitoring for multifamily assets is a little different. Most often, they do not have a BMS. Some larger ones do, but multifamily runs the gamut, and a lot of them don't have a building management system in place. There's a lot of garden-style multifamily properties that don't even have centralized equipment, and in those cases, real-time monitoring really doesn't make sense, right? So you want to target those mid-rise and those high-rise assets with centralized equipment, but you can cut straight to that equipment level sub-metering because there's often no BMS in place. But at the end of the day, you get the same benefits. Again, you're alerting those operators to when equipment is predicted to fail, even before it does. You can adjust, you know, the set points to ensure that you're using as little energy as possible, and you get all those enhanced data points. Retail and industrial are a little tricky here. We mentioned from the operations and maintenance aspect, there's often not much equipment that the landlord controls, although they increasingly do have solar, which is worth monitoring. So, you know, Enertiv is not a solar company, but if you own industrial assets, I highly recommend looking at solar. If that's something similar with sub-metering, if that's something you looked at even a few years ago, it's worth taking another look. The economics are generally fantastic. So there's a lot of different financing options there. So the playbook is, look into distributed generation, and then you can monitor the solar production as well as any other critical equipment where it makes sense. So in summary, there are both short and long-term risks to not getting started right away. The idea here is, this is our greenhouse gas intensity. So this is square meters, but you get the idea that we want to reduce the intensity of our properties before they reach the point in which they're stranded. And this is a projection that ends at 2038, but you never know when, the municipality might push new regulations or tenant preferences change that kind of bend this curve sooner. And you realize that, oh my God, in 5 years, we need to completely decarbonize or we won't have we'll have a stranded asset. You don't want to end in that position. So the idea is to kind of get started on, a lot of these are low-hanging fruit items, get started right away. And the other thing is that there's no silver bullet. We talked about, improved operations and maintenance practices, improved tenant engagement, better capital planning, real-time monitoring, distributed generation. We did not talk about embedded carbon. That's an area I don't have too much expertise in, but probably worth a whole webinar worth of material there. And obviously, your particular portfolio or your particular property type, the effect of each of these on your baseline emissions will be different. Some will be bigger, some will be non-existent, but these are a lot of the areas to focus on. And that's that. Thank you all for your time. Again, my name is Conley Wilson. My contact details are up here. Always feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions or if I can be helpful in any way. Feel free to scan this QR code if you're interested in getting a demo of the Enertiv platform. And I'll hand it back to you, David.
Great. Thank you so much for running through all that information in your presentation. And we did get some questions that have come in. So we've got a little bit under 10 minutes here. We'll try to get to as many of these as we can before we wrap up. So a question that came in here is, when accounting for the carbon footprint of a portfolio, do you think that the carbon should be owned by the tenant or the owner of the building?
Yeah, so that gets into the difference between scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. Basically, if something that you control is burning fuel to produce energy, that is scope 1. So something like a centralized boiler plant would be scope 1 for the landlord. Something that is burned somewhere else but then used by you would be scope 2. So most like electric utilities for the landlord and the tenants would be scope 2. For the tenant, the gas burned in that boiler would be scope 2 as well. So that gets into the nuances of carbon reporting and carbon accounting, but definitely a great question and something to keep in mind of.
Another question that came in here is, would it be more strategic for the property owner to go to the grid provider where the building is located to push for more renewables?
Probably. The utilities, like real estate owners think in 5 to 10 year periods, sometimes longer. Utilities think in 20, 30, 40 year periods. And many of them have felt the pressure from their municipalities, from their shareholders, et cetera, to deploy more renewable. And many of them are. It's just a very long haul. So definitely hearing from business interests, I mean, it couldn't hurt, but they're likely aware of the need. And you know, a lot of people say, for example, local law 97 in New York,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of people are calling it an electrification bill, right? Like there's only so much that landlords can do. It's really up to Con Ed to save the landlords from paying these fines. Con Ed is hearing that. They're hearing the pressure there, and they're feeling it. So um, the answer is yes, and good luck.
um, Another question here is, besides Energy Star, how can you track progress across all of these different areas?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Energy Star is really nice because it's a 0 to 100 score that anybody could understand, right? You know, like we're all used to that framework. What we do at Enertiv to track progress across all these different areas is to convert all the like granular on-site data into 0 to 100 scores. So, for example, we'll provide you with a 0 to 100 maintenance score or a 0 to 100 capital planning score, and you can see without having to dive into the weeds how how each property and then how the portfolio is progressing over time using these scores.
Another question here is, my company is a hands-off investment firm. Do you see other investors mandating this type of action in their portfolio companies?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. The you know, several of our biggest clients are exactly where you are. They're hands-off investment firms. That problem that we talked about early with siloed solutions and no standardization, they recognize that, and they said, I don't care, you know, which, you know, what property management company you are, you have to use these things because they roll up into our system, and it's our, you know, we're paying the bill. It's our visibility that matters. So definitely, if you are a investment firm, others are kind of mandating what the technology stack looks like and what initiatives are going to be supported across the portfolio, regardless of operating team.
Okay, we got time for one more question here. So, are there any non-energy benefits to these playbooks?
Yeah, definitely. So a big one that operators care about. There's, you know, like, well, energy costs money, so saving money. We talked about operations and maintenance. The maintenance and repair line item is often pretty much as big as the utility line item, if not a little bit bigger. So you can, through a lot of these strategies, you can see the same types of reductions to that line item as well. And it can also, if you get really efficient in your operations and maintenance, you can unlock things like multi-site staffing, and really improve your operations and maintenance economics that way. Besides that, you know, increased transparency and visibility. We talked about that. Aligning your whole organization, kind of infusing your whole organization with decarbonization and sustainability in mind, is a big one. And then, you know, getting alerted to issues, disaster scenarios before they turn into that. You know, you ask a landlord who's just had a big leak, you know, what they would do to have averted that, and you know, they would have done anything. So getting ahead of like disaster scenarios is another big non-energy benefit there.
Okay. All right. Well, with that, we're at the hour, so I'm going to wrap things up here. So I want to thank Comley for for doing the presentation and for answering all those questions. Would also like to thank Enertiv for making today's webinar possible. For the audience, once you leave, a short survey is going to pop up in your browser window. We would appreciate it if you could share your feedback, as it does help us provide you with the most relevant content going forward. On behalf of Wealth Management Real Estate, thank you for joining us and have a great rest of the day.
Thanks for having me, David. And thank you everyone for joining.